little video on things I have learnt from the Greek of Acts. It's a random collection in some ways, but yeah, it's things of interest to me that have stuck out to me, and things that I've learnt over the years as I've studied it in its original Greek, and also as I've helped to translate it into various other Pacific Island languages. So just to comment at the start, there are 3 we sections in Acts, and those are the references. Let's look at this one from Acts 16. They're going along with third person. They tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not let them. And then they went to Troas. And Paul saw a dream, a man of Macedonia, this famous incident, a man of Macedonia calling him, "Come and help us." And here in verse 10, now Luke goes into first person, we. When he saw the dream, when he had the dream, Paul, we immediately tried, this ending is a first person, we tried to go to Macedonia, concluding that God was calling us to evangelize, to preach the gospel to them. So without any fanfare, Luke just quietly changes his pronouns from third person, they, to first person, us. So here we see Luke keeping his profile pretty low, but also proud to let us know that he was there. Another little point, important things repeated in Acts: Paul's conversion in those verses, the conversion of Cornelius in those places, and then the apostolic decree in those places. This was noted by F.F. Bruce and the introduction to his commentary. And as scholars have pointed out, Luke didn't have italic or bold fonts to use, but we can assume that the things that he repeats, he regards as important. Okay, now a little bit about chapter 2 and the coming of the Holy Spirit. There are a couple of words used here that don't always come out in translation, but they seem to be deliberate links by Luke. First, you've got the tongues, glossai, the tongues, hose puros, like fire, and then they began to speak in other tongues or languages. As the pneuma, the Spirit, gave them utterance, as the old translations say, ability to speak. But there is a link between this pneuma and pnois, wind, a noise like a mighty rushing wind. And there was the coming of the Spirit. Another little comment, they broke bread, and this was an idiom meaning they ate together. They didn't have sliced bread in those days. And when they sat down to eat, the head of the family would break off chunks and distribute them. When I was living in Vanuatu and learning the Urupef language, I heard people talk about scraping taro. It took me a long time to figure out what it meant. It actually meant cooking taro on a fire in the garden area, then scraping off the burnt bits and eating it. But they just said, for short, they just said scraping taro. But that was only part of what they did, but it's just an idiom. In the same way, broke bread, in Bible times that meant breaking the bread, sharing it out, and eating together. In the Christian context, it also meant celebrating the Lord's Supper, which was a full meal in the early church. Moving on to Acts 2:44. All those who believed were together and they had all things in common. The church father Tertullian alludes to this verse in his wry comment that Christians have all things in common except their wives, which is the opposite of what is the case among their neighbours. The opposite of what is the case among the heathen. Another comment, Acts 4:19 and 20. Interesting that the angels had the job of getting the apostles out of prison, but not of preaching. Angels could surely have done a much better job than humans telling God's message of salvation. And you can just imagine the angels saying, "Oh God, please let me preach. Just let me preach one sermon. Peter, he makes such a botch of it. And Paul, we could do it much better than either of them, or Apollos, or any of them." But God says, "No, your job is to release Peter from prison, and then you come back." God's kept the job for us, despite all our faults and failings and stutterings and stammerings. Remarkable. Moving on to chapter 6, verse 7. F.F. Bruce, again in his commentary, notes this verse is one of a series of progress reports in Acts, each covering a period of about 5 years. And another little comment on Acts chapter 7, verse 18. Until another king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's what it says literally. Did not know Joseph. Well, this could mean who didn't know about Joseph, but didn't care about Joseph is more likely. The meaning area of the biblical word extends to this. I'm sure the court records would tell him all about Joseph, so it's not a matter of he didn't know anything about Joseph. And it's pretty sure to mean he had no regard for Joseph. And you'll find that a change was made in the two NIV versions between the 1984 and the 2011, where they've changed from the literal "did not know Joseph" to something like "didn't care about Joseph." Here's an interesting one. They knelt and called out in a loud voice. Well, he knelt, sorry. "Lord, do not hold this sin against him." And having said this, he fell asleep. That's what this literally says. Even though he dies a violent death, Stephen is said to fall asleep, which is a common euphemism in the Bible, indicating a peaceful death, equivalent to the English saying he passed away. So here he is dying under a hail of stones, and he dies a peaceful death. By contrast, in the case of Ananias and Sapphira and Herod Agrippa, the plain speaking word exepsuxen is used. His soul or his life went out. And an interesting cultural detail concerning people's addresses. These are given in a couple of places in Acts. In the ancient world, there was no such thing as street numbers, and many streets didn't have names at all. So Ananias was sent to the house of Judas on Straight Street. Cornelius' servants are sent to look for the house of Simon the lettermaker, who lives in a house near the sea. This must have been the case in cities for a long time. Here's how Isaac Newton addressed a letter in the 17th century in London, in a house about the middle of Old Pall Mall in St James's Field in Westminster. Today in Vila and Vanuatu, very few streets have names, and I don't think any house has a number. I'm told that even such a huge city as Tokyo is the same. The system we use in modern Western cities is a good indicator of how organized and impersonal our life has become. Related to this is identifying people. As a Roman citizen, Paul would have had a full Roman name with two other names besides Paul, but we never told him. And when an issue of identification comes up, his city of origin is given rather than his full name, Saul of Tarsus. And we have Simon the tanner, identified by his trade. And incidentally, that's where a lot of our modern family names come. Simon the tanner just becomes Simon Tanner. That's his name. In 12:17, Peter says, "Tell James what has happened." There's no need to specify that this is not the James who we heard in verse 2 got killed. And it's not specified in the Greek text. Maybe some translations do. And in some translations it's necessary. I was checking a translation in Papua New Guinea a few years ago, and I was told that the spirits of beheaded people are believed to be unusually powerful. So they might have made the assumption that the James in verse 17 was the same James in verse 2. Now this issue of Saul and Paul in chapter 13, and they're in Salamis, and they meet the governor Sergius Paulus. This is in the dative form with the O ending. A knowing man, an intelligent man. And so then in verse 9 we're introduced for the first time to Paul's Roman name, which is Paul. Some people wrongly assume that Paul changed his name in Acts, but he obviously had a Hebrew name, Saul, and he had a Greek and a Roman name, Paulos. And that's what it says here, Saul Hokai, who was also Paul. But this could also mean Saul, who also was called Paul, also meaning in addition to this man Sergius Paulus. Now our English translations have obscured the fact that these names are identical in the Greek text, because we've taken this name into English and we've crossed off the Greek and Latin ending. Yet in most versions it's left. The Greek and Latin ending is left on the name of Sergius Paulus. So that fact that those names are identical is lost in translation. But it seems that Luke is making something of this, that Saul has a Roman name, Paul, and it's the same as the name of this intelligent Roman, high-ranking Roman officer, Sergius Paulus, who looks very favorably on Christianity, because it's a big part of Luke's aim in writing Acts to show that the Roman Empire had nothing against Christianity, and in fact often supported Paul in his problems with his fellow Jews. Paul's dream of the man from Macedonia, well, we've also looked at that, but I just made a note here, brings to mind St. Patrick's call to Ireland, just over 300 years later. "We beg you, holy youth, come and walk with us once more." And Acts 17, where Paul preaches to the people of Athens, and someone noted on this spot, Apollo declared 6 centuries earlier, when a man dies and his blood is shed on the ground, there is no resurrection. So this explains why the people of Athens were a little bit skeptical when Paul said that. They didn't believe such a thing could happen. But nevertheless, some of them were convinced by Paul, as we read. Just a little note on Felix and Drusilla. Felix was procurator of Judea, in other words, the Roman governor in charge of it. His wife Drusilla was the sister of Herod Agrippa and a great-grandson of Herod the Great, the one who who tried to kill the baby Jesus. Felix and Drusilla had a son named Agrippa who died in the famous volcanic eruption at Vesuvius in 79 AD. Coming to the voyage at sea, when we were translating this into Urpic, they had no special word for paddle, so we translated here a paddle used for steering the canoe. This turned out to be more accurate. Yeah, what I meant here to say here is no special word for rudder. There's a little mistake there. They had no special word for rudder, so we had to translate here the paddle used for steering the canoe. This turned out to be more accurate than I realized at the time. Western ships also used steering oars. They didn't get rudders as we know them until they were copied from China along with the compass about 1100 AD. They also had no lee boards to stop leeward drift, no watertight compartments, and they had square sails which were much less efficient for sailing into the wind than the lug sails of the Chinese junks. No wonder sea travel was slow and dangerous. Paul's party was travelling on a grain ship. There were no passenger ships. Rome was fed with imported grain, mostly coming from Egypt. Because of this, the importance of this trade, the grain ships were the biggest and best vessels the Romans had. So even a high-ranking Roman soldier, he just had to co-opt a grain ship to take his prisoner to Rome. Okay, and I'm going to conclude with a few notes about humor in Acts. I did a video on humor in the Bible, which you can find on my YouTube channel. But this is a few more little bits. And this is chapter 12, where Peter is released from prison. And here is the Greek of it. The disciples, engrossed in prayers for Peter in prison, dispute a humble slave girl's testimony that he was standing right at their door. Here is my attempt at a translation. Rhoda recognized Peter's voice, but in her joy she forgot to open the door. She ran back into the room where the disciples were praying and blurted, "Peter's at the door!" "You're crazy," they said. "He is," she insisted. "Can't be. Must be his angel," they said. Peter, all the while, kept knocking. Finally, they opened the door and saw for themselves. They were amazed. Yeah. There's another one where Paul casts a spirit out of a girl who was trailing them and annoying them. So he said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, go out of her." And when her owners saw that their means of income had gone out, the same word used in kind of ironic humor. Another one in chapter 17, laughing at the Athenians' obsession with the new. And chapter 19, the riot in Ephesus. Most of them had, there was a big riot. Everybody was shouting out different things. By the way, here's the word here, ecclesia, which is usually translated church, but in its original Greek meaning, it was just the assembly of all the people, the coming together. And in this case, most of them had no idea what it was all about, but they were just joining in and, having a good old, enjoying themselves, running around and shouting about whatever they didn't know. Here's another case of a near riot when Paul is up in front of the Jews, and he sees that half the group are Pharisees and half are Sadducees, and he was well acquainted with their arguments. So he kind of sets them off against each other by saying, I'm being tried here on the issue of resurrection. And immediately it sets off a big argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these underlined terms are showing these Krage Megali, a great shout. The shouting became louder, says the Good News Bible. And when the argument became so violent, so it's just a little humorous, just picturing these guys all getting getting very hot under the collar and arguing and getting violent too, because the Roman commander has to snatch Paul away to stop him from getting torn apart. Okay, let's just finish off with another look at this great picture and the humor of the group of apostles praying and praying for Peter and not believing it when their prayers were answered.